Having a paranormal experience can be terrifying, but can you imagine an entity going after your own child? That level of fear is unimaginable. Well, today's stories will give a glimpse of exactly what that's like. So settle in, get comfy, and enjoy tonight's Sleepless Night Tale. My newly born daughter and I stayed in this little old Victorian house somewhere at the edge of town. She was my first child, and I was still getting used to raising a kid all by myself at the time. It was not an easy task for a single mom, but I was trying my best. One night, I was woken up by a loud noise coming from my baby monitor. Lately, I'd been sleeping on the verge ever since I had my baby, so I'd become used to being woken up in the middle of the night, and tonight was no different. I quickly went to check on my baby, and to my surprise, she was fast asleep. I waited a while to see if she was going to wake up, but it didn't look like it, so after a while, I went back to bed. I had barely dozed off again when I heard another noise, this time a lot louder than before. I quickly got up, but this time I decided to check the camera feed first to see if I could tell where the noise was coming from. And as I leaned closer, I heard a clear and pronounced whisper coming from the monitor. My eyes widened in shock. It sounded like a woman's voice, singing a lullaby, but in a language I didn't recognize. I rushed to my baby's room and noticed that she was just waking up, and as soon as she opened her eyes, she let out a scream. I spent the next few minutes calming her down, and after some time, I managed to put her back to sleep, just in time to catch up on a few hours of rest myself. But in the back of my mind, I just couldn't brush off what I heard earlier. I couldn't explain where the lullaby was coming from. Was I hallucinating it? I mean, considering how tired I was at that point, it's quite possible I was. So I put it out of my mind, and I tried to go back to sleep. As I lay there in bed, I struggled to fall asleep. I had more questions than answers spinning in my mind. I must have passed out at some point because the next thing I remember was my alarm going off, and it was already morning. This was very unusual for me because I normally wake up multiple times a night to my baby crying. But last night, after I put her back to sleep, she didn't wake up again. So as you can imagine, when I saw the time, I got up in a panic and rushed to my baby's room to check on her. But she was still fast asleep. As I stood there next to her, I started to remember the singing from last night, but I couldn't remember if I dreamt it or not. The whole thing was kind of still a blur to me. The more I thought about it though, the more real it became. That day, I spent the morning doing chores around the house. I also spent some time with my baby, and she seemed to be perfectly fine. In fact, she was unusually calm, which was great, but it did feel a bit strange. I kept getting this nagging feeling though, that something about last night was not right. I didn't know exactly what it was, but the feeling was very real, and it bothered me. Later that day, I was putting my baby to sleep for her afternoon nap. I looked over at the baby monitor in her room, and the nagging feeling started creeping in once again. It grew louder in my ears, and it got so loud that I had to do something. That's when I decided to have a look at the video recording from the baby monitor, just to see if I had maybe missed something. But what I saw next made my skin crawl. I didn't notice anything at first, and then I heard those bangs that woke me up the night before. But there was nothing on the recording that really indicated where they were coming from though, so I kept watching. I saw myself going to check on her the second time, and then I saw myself leaving. And that's when I saw something. The minute I closed the door and returned to my room, there was a shadow figure approaching from the same direction I had just left. It was rapidly moving towards my baby's crib. It looked like a woman wearing a large, old-fashioned dress and a bonnet. I could see her move until she came to a stop, just as she reached the crib. And then the woman disappeared out of thin air. But the story didn't end there. Once she disappeared, I could see my baby waking up and staring at the ceiling. She didn't cry and she didn't make any noise whatsoever. At one point, she started reaching up for something, but there was nothing there. I couldn't believe my eyes, but my daughter was clearly playing with something above her head, and smiling. I was completely terrified. No way was I gonna stay one more minute in this old house. I began looking for a new place right away, and I ended up calling one of my close friends, just to ask if we could stay at her place for a while. I must have sounded completely crazy with what I was telling her, but I needed to protect my baby from this spirit or whatever it was that attached itself to this house. I must admit, I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that before this time, but I had no explanation for what I was seeing, and honestly, it really scared me. The thought that something was coming after my own child shook me to my core. I ended up moving to a new place about a week later, and thankfully, that was the last of my paranormal experiences. But sometimes, I still wake up at night in a panic, and I rush to make sure that everything's alright. And when I close my eyes, late at night, I can still hear that haunting lullaby. "6 months ago, that's when we first started hearing the noises. Our newborn daughter, Lily, was in the middle of it all. Even thinking about this still gives me the creeps to this day. I was in the kitchen with my husband, preparing dinner. We had just put Lily down to sleep for the afternoon. As usual, we put the baby monitor down on the kitchen counter to hear if she woke up. Suddenly, our routine was interrupted by a noise coming from the baby monitor. It made this awful creaking sound, and then we heard a soft movement coming from Lily's room just down the hall. We made our way to her room and opened the door. At first, we were puzzled. We looked at each other because we didn't know where the noise was coming from. It must have been a draft causing the door to move or open, so we just kind of shrugged it off. We looked over at Lily, expecting to find her sleeping, but she was wide awake and she was staring towards us, as if she were looking right through us. It was like she didn't even notice that we were there. This was quite strange because usually Lily would cry whenever she woke up, but this time she had just calmly jostled awake without a sound. After we had put Lily to sleep for the night, we both made our way back to the bedroom and turned on the baby monitor. We could hear the gentle sound of Lily sleeping, tiny snores and breathing sounds that put our minds at ease. We were exhausted, so we passed out almost instantly, but not even 30 minutes went by before we were startled awake by something disturbing. Out of the darkness, we heard a knock coming from somewhere in the house, followed by a burst of loud static from the baby monitor. My husband, being the hero that he is, jolted upright, fueled by adrenaline and curiosity. He quietly and swiftly crept down the hallway to see what the sound was, and I watched him disappear into the darkness. I waited in my bed, trying to stay as quiet as I could be, so I could hear if there were any other sounds coming. I could hear my breathing intensify, and I tried holding my breath so I could hear better into the piercing silence. Time felt like it was standing still. I heard nothing, and finally, I let out a breath. And at that moment, my husband came back to the bedroom, quietly, with a look of fear on his face that I had never seen before. He motioned for me to follow him, so I did. I followed him to Lily's room, and we both stood in awe. The baby monitor was on the floor, as if someone had knocked it over. And then I saw Lily. She was awake, but not just that, she was standing upright in her crib, with both arms held out in front of her, as if she was waiting to be picked up by someone. As if this weren't weird enough, there was something else about this that freaked us out even more, and that was the fact that Lily hadn't learned to walk yet at the time. She could barely stand on her own, yet here she was, standing perfectly upright on this unstable bed, like someone was supporting her. This scared the hell out of me, and my instincts kicked in. I stepped forward into the room, and as soon as my foot touched the carpet, Lily dropped immediately. She began screaming. I quickly picked her up and held her close to me. I took Lily back to our room and decided we couldn't let her sleep in that room by herself. Something weird was going on, and we needed to figure out what we were going to do. My husband came up with an idea. He said we should install a camera in the nursery to try and capture and understand what was happening. We already had cameras set up around the house, so my husband installed a new one in Lily's bedroom. A couple of days went by, but nothing happened. No noises in the night, and nothing concerning picked up by the camera. We started to feel that we were losing our minds, or that we might have just seriously overreacted. But just as we had begun settling into that idea, we were abruptly proven otherwise when night 4 rolled by. After that, everything changed. I was fast asleep, and suddenly I was awoken by the sound of laughter. It was Lily. My heart sank. It's happening again, I thought. I stood up and made my way to her room. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit with a strong smell of perfume in the air, and I saw Lily laying in her crib, laughing and swiping at something in the air. Although this was very strange, there was something different this time. I couldn't understand why. I should have been terrified and rushing over to help her. But I felt calm. It's really hard to explain, but whatever presence was here with us now felt protective, almost motherly. It was really weird. It wasn't long after that when Lily fell asleep again, and then the strange experiences stopped. I went back to my room, deep in thought about what had just happened, and quietly, I went back to sleep. The next morning, I spoke to my husband about what had just happened, and his face was pallid and mortified. "And you did nothing?" he said. I struggled to explain it, but when we watched the footage of the previous night, it all started to make sense to me. In the footage, just before I entered Lily's room, I saw a faint outline of a familiar shape. It couldn't be, could it? I looked at my husband and I told him what I was thinking. "It's Mom," I said. He looked at me like I was insane, but I just knew it was her. When I had entered the room last night, I knew I recognized that smell from somewhere. It was the same perfume my mom would wear. There was no doubt in my mind. The shape on the camera footage, the smell of the perfume, and the feeling I got when I opened that door, it was her. It had to be. She was just watching over her grandchild all this time. You see, my mother had passed away while I was pregnant with Lily, and she never got to meet her granddaughter. So it made complete sense to me that if she were reaching out from the other side, she would have wanted to be close to Lily and to let me know that she was watching over us. This whole experience made me reconsider my beliefs and my understanding of life and death. I was never a believer in any of these types of things, but when you encounter something so unexplainable and so real, it really changes your perspective. Maybe there is an explanation for what we experienced back then, but we'll probably never know. At least, not in this lifetime. Thanks for listening to today's story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like these types of videos, consider subscribing so you don't miss any of our future uploads. If you want to hear more, you can check out some of our other videos right here. Until next time, good night.